our second moderator is Ms. Louisa Greve. She's a Vice President of the National Endowment for Democracy. She's actually in charge of East Asia, Middle East, North Africa, and global affairs. So I'm very pleased to welcome her to moderate the second panel.
Thank you so much, Alan. While our panelists are getting settled, I will pick up on a comment made by Dr. Flipsy that it's terrific to have a report that helps everyone to understand the question of extremism or connection to violence on the part of a whole population of Uyghurs or the politically conscious Uyghurs can be easily put to rest. And I will say the entire research effort of the UAA, which Scott also commended, stems in part from the effort that when the UAA had just been founded in the 1990s and then started to make contact with people like Yang Jinli with NED, they wanted to raise their voice, the moral question, repression, religious repression. But as Scott said, you need facts as well as ideas and moral power. And they have moral power, they had ideas, but they didn't have the facts. There wasn't the good documentation in any language. And so UHRP was founded by the UAA, which had many other demands on its attention to the welfare of the Uyghurs who are here in the United States, a very small number, only a couple of hundred if you think about it. Fewer than 500 people even living in the US, most of whom not able to be politically active. Nonetheless, they pulled together, founded a project, did secure NED support, and so years later now we have a series of high-level reports that Chang mentioned. I'm happy to see this one. At that time it was just blankness among the population, trying to understand who are the Uyghurs and what's their issue. And of course, unfortunately now, post 9/11, the Chinese government does make cynical use, in my opinion, of the concern about international linkages for terrorism linked to Islamic ideology, political ideology linked to Islam, and uses that as a brush with which to tar the Uyghurs and their political demands. So we have from blankness to research, and then from research that also deals with this question of doubts in some people's minds about who the Uyghurs really are. I'm glad to be joined by our panelists who will talk about any additional points to supplement what our authors told us, to help us understand what the issue is, and help people who are interested in doing something, action. The recommendations in the report are on page 88. Recommendations for the Chinese government, page 89, recommendations for concerned governments, and page 90 for the intergovernmental organizations. And so I'm hoping our panelists will be able to comment on that. We'll have to be brief so that we can leave another time question Q&A session at the end. So we'll begin with Kumar, right? So Kumar represents Amnesty International on all issues of the Asia Pacific in Washington, D.C. He unfortunately will also have to leave before the end of the panel, but we're very glad he could join us, and he will make 2 or 3 points to bring to our forefront of our consciousness as we consider the report.
Thank you, Louisa. Appreciate it. Very simple. Amnesty International is pleased to be here to join this important issue that's being discussed. We had numerous discussions on Uyghur human rights issues. And today it's about religion specific. But when I got invited, I was wondering why Uyghurs have been singled out. Is it because of the ethnicity or is it because of their religion? In 1999, when we issued a report, we focused on religious issues, but we focused mainly on ethnic issues, that Uyghurs as ethnic minorities have been facing these abuses. We documented execution of political prisoners. At that time, only in Xinjiang, only Uyghurs were executed. Then of course there's one exception in Tibet, and one Tibetan or 2 Tibetans were executed. But general trend is that political prisoners are executed only among Uyghurs in China. Special form of torture we documented. So the question arises, the government's intention is to suppress ethnic identity or to religious issues. My observation is that they are going after Uyghurs because of their ethnic identity and their political aspirations to be free and independent, or even to get more rights in the country. And for Chinese government, the religion became a convenient tool. Over 95% of Uyghurs are Muslims, so that becomes a convenient tool. They did not take advantage of that until September 11th, 9/11. After 9/11, they found an excellent opportunity to take advantage of this opportunity, to go after Uyghurs in the form of religion as well. Even though the same religious persecutions were taking place before, it got a different dynamics afterwards. So now the Uyghurs are facing two major issues. One is they have been singled out because of their ethnicity. Number two, their religion, predominantly Muslim religion. So when you mix these two, the abuses are intense and extensive. Going to Hajj, not allowing people to worship freely, these are all part and parcel of the game. So that's where we are today. What we are seeing in Xinjiang for the Uyghurs is the deadly mix of ethnicity plus the religion. If you want to take away the religion, then we have to do more good. Chinese government should realize they can't take advantage of this war and terror issue as an excuse to go after Uyghurs because of the dynamics in that particular region. They have a different agenda. They want to crack the Chinese. So in a nutshell, I will conclude by saying that our challenge, internationally and domestically, is that how to at least separate the religious angle and to send a strong message to the Chinese authorities. You can't take advantage of this. There is very unfortunate thing that happened from the Washington itself that is helping Chinese to go after Uyghurs. That is listing of one of the Uyghur armed group, I don't know whether it exists anymore, as a terrorist organization. So it's time that US government review that, now that US is leaving Afghanistan, review that to see whether there is any merit to it. When they listed this group, it's East Turkestan, some group, Amnesty International officially came out and said this is wrong. We, as a human rights organization, reality position on this. But our researchers found out this is something political that's been manipulated in this situation. So there are two avenues we can work on. One is in Washington, to urge the administration to review, continue listing of this one Uyghur former armed group, I don't know whether it ever exists anymore, still in the list of terrorist organizations that helps Chinese to go after. The other one is to US to take a leadership in the UN Human Rights Council and other places to ensure that Uyghur abusers and other abusers in China take a priority. Only about 2 weeks left for President Obama to meet the new president of China. Let him speak up. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I would like to turn next to Sophie Richardson, who's China Director at Human Rights Watch. Sophie, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much for inviting me to join you today, and congratulations on a terrific report. This is, I think, a fantastic and badly needed update on the nuances of some of these policies. I just wanted to spend a few minutes talking about what we see as one of the very clear consequences of these restrictions that are prompting people to leave, that I think dovetails also with a fairly alarming trend on behalf of the Chinese government. This pertains specifically to ensuring protections for Uyghur asylum seekers who are seeking protections outside of China. This has not gotten a lot of attention, and from from our perspective, it's a very serious problem. The first of these cases that I think got a lot of attention was at the end of 2009 when a group of 20 Uyghurs who had already been given sort of the first level of recognition by the UN refugee agency in Cambodia were actually forcibly returned to China, clearly at the request of the Chinese government. So these were people whose cases had effectively already been lodged with the relevant refugee authorities and should have been allowed the opportunity to exhaust that process, but were forcibly sent back to China before that could be followed through. And for anybody who wants nuts and bolts of international law, it's a violation of international law to return people to a situation where they have a well-founded fear of persecution and are likely to face torture. And obviously, Uyghurs being forced back to China or being sought by the government clearly fell into that category. And at the time, we and many others were very alarmed at the relatively flat-footed response of other governments who are aware that this was happening. We've continued to track cases like that over the last couple of years, most recently a case in Malaysia when on New Year's Eve of 2012, 6 Uyghurs who were already in immigration detention in Malaysia, they had allegedly used false passports to try to leave Malaysia to get to Turkey. They too had claims under consideration with the UN High Commissioner for Refugees authorities. They were actually taken by Malaysian counterterrorism police out of immigration detention and handed over to Chinese officials and sent back to China. None of the people in either of these cases really are we clear on what exactly has happened to them since they have been forcibly returned. I think these cases to us represent a very particular and aggressive strategy on the Chinese government's part to undercut refugee claims and to suggest to people that even if you physically make it out of the country and even if you manage to lodge a first level claim with the relevant authorities, you aren't necessarily guaranteed the protections you're entitled under international law. In a little bit of a separate category, we continue to see cases, I was struck by your phrase, Louisa, that doubts about who Uyghurs are. You know, we continue to see cases where refugee status or refugee status determination isn't properly followed simply because immigration authorities can't make the distinction between an ethnic Han and a Uyghur. You know, we haven't done the research to be able to really substantiate this point, but you know, many immigration authorities know what a Tibetan is. They know what a Chinese person is. A lot of them don't know what Uyghurs are. And as a result, they often, I think, don't get the proper consideration they should in a very sort of dry procedural way that has enormous consequences for whether people actually get to have their claims heard. So we know that this issue about refugee status determination is something that all of the governments that have bilateral human rights dialogues with China are aware of and think about and write about. It's not translating into, I think, practical policy changes or, frankly, boot camp for the relevant immigration officials who are the first line of defense in making sure that people are given the kinds of protections that they need in very dire circumstances. So if we could tack a policy recommendation on here, it is essentially that, you know, as I think we will probably continue to see more people leaving the region because of these restrictions, we need to see commensurate education of the people whose job it is to make sure that people who are seeking protections overseas actually follow the process properly. So I'm going to stop there.
Thank you. Very disturbing to think about, problems that aren't wholly contained within the logic of an authoritarian government, but that are happening in the democratic countries with the rule of law, and very much worthy of our attention. We'll next turn to Amy Reger, who is a researcher with the Congressional Executive Commission on China, with a focus on Xinjiang. She is also, if I may say, a former UHRP researcher. So we're very glad that you could come back, as it were, to come and comment on the report and what we need to understand in order to make a difference in this situation. Thanks, Amy.
Thank you, Louisa, and thanks to UAA and UHRP for having me here to talk about this very important topic. and report. I'm happy to be here. I wanted to talk a little bit about the emphasis of central and regional officials on stability, which is aided by heavy investment and also heated rhetoric by regional officials, because this emphasis on stability.
Go back just a little bit, it's too loud.
I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Oh.
just sit there, it's good.
Okay, sorry. The emphasis on stability has provided a backdrop for authorities' efforts to control and to restrict Uyghur religious activities. We've seen a trend, as I said, of very heavy and increasing investment in the regional security budget, which we saw quite a large increase of nearly 90% in the regional security budget in 2010. This came after the July 2009 unrest that took place in the regional capital of Urumqi, and this trend of heavy security investment is continuing. Last year, we saw an investment of $1.5 billion US in the regional public security sector. It's not as dramatic an increase as we saw in 2010, but it's still quite high at 23% over 2011. And we've also seen rhetoric that officials use to link Uyghur Islam with ethnic separatism and terrorism, and an emphasis on fighting the three evil forces. Just late last year, Regional Government Chairman Nur Bakri talked about the need to fight the three evil forces, and he said that this fight against them and against separatism in the region would be long-term, complicated, and fierce. And regional authorities continue to look at religious extremism and the three forces as threatening stability in the region, and they also use this to maintain targeted surveillance over individual religious believers. We saw reports a few months ago about local officials keeping very detailed portfolios of individual Muslims, Uyghur Muslims, even around Kashgar, including information on people's education, their family members, their current attitude, although that's not specified, their economic situation, and very, very detailed information kept on people, and there's no specification on what is required for these for people to have such a portfolio. And I also wanted to bring up the issue of training of imams and buwi, which is mentioned also in UHRP's report. Buwi are female Uyghur religious specialists, and the training over the past year, we've seen a focus from regional leaders on instilling patriotism and telling imams and buwi that they must fight illegal religious activities and also hostile forces that might want to use religion to carry out criminal activities in the region. And this training helps regional officials to promote state policies and to continue to assert their control over religion. In late last year, we saw that the Kashgar Women's Federation sent a team of 19 buwi to eastern China and heavily stressed that these buwi must transmit the party's policies on ethnicity and religion upon their return. and also they must propagate ethnic unity. And we have seen that Uyghurs who dare to practice Islam outside of state control are punished. For example, beginning in March of this year, there was a young man in Kashgar who he was detained without charge for selling the Quran and Quranic study aids, a pen that you use it's an electronic pen to help you read and understand the Quran. So for selling these things, he was detained. He was just recently released after a little over 2 months in detention without charge. And although he wasn't charged, reportedly, his case is consistent with cases that we've heard about of people possessing illegal religious materials or selling or distributing illegal religious materials. And sometimes we've seen people charged and sentenced to lengthy sentences for those crimes. So, in effect, as many of the panelists and speakers have said today, Uyghur Islam exists in this very politically charged, tightly controlled environment. There's not much space for Uyghurs to practice their Islamic beliefs outside of state control, and it's very difficult for them to maintain their own religious beliefs and practices in this environment.
Thank you so much, Amy. Excellent context, and I also think you raise an important question about a coalition, because many times when you start talking about women's rights, and you're talking about an issue where Islam is at the forefront of culture and perhaps politics, a lot of times we're talking about, are there power holders in the community who have beliefs about women's rights being less than equal that come from their interpretation of Islam. And we're talking about women's rights to practice Islam. And so it may take a bit of work for Uyghur advocates to think about how to have coalitions with people very concerned about women's rights, but it's going to upend some of their assumptions about what the biggest threats to women's rights and freedom of speech and freedom of thought and freedom of religion come from. So that's something else to think about coming out of this panel. So now we'll turn to Sue Vaughn from Freedom House. She has particular responsibility for Southeast Asia, all kinds of issues about human rights and democracy. And she's going to give us perhaps a regional or global perspective, and again thinking about opportunities for further action and coalition building.
Thanks, Lisa. Thank you to UHRP. This is an excellent report, and to the authors, congratulations. As a lapsed academic, I read this last night, and even the footnotes were really eloquently written, so kudos to Henrik and Greg. As I was reading this last night, one of the things, I have the distinction of being the only non-China expert on this panel, and I get less than expert on the issues that I work on as time goes by. But as I was reading this, one of the things that came to mind was Hannah Arendt's phrase of the banality of evil. And I want to reference two specific instances which were just beautifully captured by the authors. One was, governments are getting much more sophisticated in using tools for repression. We don't see the clumsy use of sort of outright banning of religions or religious practice. It's much more insidious. And two of the examples that I found very chilling, but at the same time humorous slightly, was the banning of facial hair for men. And they said in doing that, they also banned portraits of Marx, Engels, and Lenin, which I found interesting in a communist country, but, well, the contradictions of modern communism. The other example that I also found interesting and somewhat chilling was the reconstitution of the mosque in the shopping plaza, which included a Carrefour and a KFC. So you have communism, full-fledged communism in the form of KFC and Carrefour, and then you have a reconstituted mosque, and the loud noise actually prevented practitioners from engaging in practice. Which brings me to the point of governments being much more sophisticated in how they repress religion. One thing that I found really interesting, and to follow on Amy's point about women, most governments are quite stupid about how subversive women can be. So they actually think this is sort of an innocuous constituency. Actually, maybe they don't, because they do think that the education of women is a terrible thing. But what was really interesting in this report, which I haven't seen in other places with other religions, is how the Chinese authorities went after women and children in trying to curb their right to attend religious instruction, attend mosques, and I thought that was really interesting because, you know, the Chinese authorities are smart. Women, you know, what is the best transmission belts for religion within a family and community? Women and children. And children form the next generation of leaders. So I thought that was really, really interesting. To get back to how sophisticated governments are, and we see this, China is interesting, and as I said, I'm not a China expert, but we see this in Vietnam, we see this in Cambodia, we see this in Burma. Increasingly every morning I wake up to some kind of quote-unquote communal violence. Governments are interestingly also, the language that they use in framing these repressive tactics, this ongoing repression is interesting. It's never, you know, a crackdown. It's always communal violence or sectarian violence, which sort of denotes that there's an equality in terms of violence committed by the Uyghurs against the Han Chinese and from the Han Chinese against the Uyghurs. And this report is excellent because if you really sort of deconstruct some of the discourse that's happening around some of these issues, you'll see that these quote-unquote spontaneous outpourings of communal violence have pogrom-like elements where government forces, security forces are very much complicit in some of the things that are happening. And again, this is not just the case in China. I think they go to the same schools. I think there's a school for repressive authoritarian regimes where they have bad lessons learned transmitted between each other. I was born in Sri Lanka. You see that with the Sri Lankans. You see that with the Cambodians, you see that with the Vietnamese, the Chinese, and it's a cooptation of whatever the majority religion is. So controlling the imams, controlling the Sangha means that the government has control. So again, going back to my main point, repressive regimes are much more sophisticated than they were 10 or 20 years ago. They're not going to do an outright ban on Uyghur Islam or anything like that. It's going to be much more strategic, much more insidious. And that leads me to the other couple of things that I've noticed, both in China and in other countries. There's a really chilling effect of self-censorship. I think Henrik and Greg both pointed out to the fact that people were really quite scared to talk about the experience, and I think it's a real testament to the courage of the Uyghur community that these case studies are revealed in this report, because look, it's very easy for us to stay in a Western country and say, you know, we have laws that govern religion. But this, in countries where religious identity, ethnic identity, political identity are all sort of fused, it's chilling. Not only you, but your family, your extended family can be impacted. You lose your job, your children can't go to school. It's a terrifying thing. So the self-censorship is the best tool that repressive governments have by using these very sort of, as I said, insidious, that's the only term to use. The other thing is governments, again, are very sophisticated. It's not going to be the political authorities themselves that are going to engage in these crackdowns. They often use government proxies. And again, we see this in countries around Southeast Asia, in the use of non-state actors, enacting violence against minority religious communities. And, you know, I will end by saying Freedom House is concerned about freedom of religion, not just intrinsically because we're concerned about freedom of religion, which is an important issue to be concerned about. We're concerned about it because that's an issue where all other freedoms converge. So you have freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, freedom of association. And if governments can control freedom of religion, then they can control all these other freedoms that are fundamental to the human condition. And I think in that way, you know, this is ultimately a form of social control. I will end by saying our own governments, including the US government, need to be a little bit more sophisticated in how they also counter some of the arguments put forth by repressive authoritarian regimes about terrorism, about counterterrorism, etc. And sort of really think about the language that governments are using in calling these sectarian conflicts and communal conflicts. Because if you dig a little bit deeper, as this report has excellently done, you find out that these things are not spontaneous. These are not communities that live side by side and suddenly violence erupted. Through education, through relocation policies, all these communal differences are manipulated by government authorities, and then they can play the hero by doing a crackdown and saying, well, we're cracking down against all these ethnic minorities that are up in arms. So on that very depressing note, I'm a human rights activist. I'm very cynical about even our own governments in terms of pressing on these issues. I think it's an issue that in terms of advocating, we should think about self-interest issues, self-interest of the Chinese government. I think Scott mentioned this. If you want stability, if you want security, if you want economic investment, stability is important. So if you're not, to these governments, I say, if you're not doing this because you believe deeply in the provisions of the UDHR, do it because you're interested in attracting more investment from KFC and Carrefour. So thank you.